All right, hey everyone. This is going to be the third lesson in this series where we're trying to teach this mechanical engineer how to become a software engineer, or at least improve his software skills. How you doing?
Very good. How about you?
Good. Yeah. So last time we went through a little bit about lists and we iterated through it, and we found the minimum in the list we had, right?
Mm-hmm.
So today we're actually going to go a little bit more in depth with for loops and while loops, conditional statements, and we'll talk a little bit about strings too. So this is probably a two-part lesson. So just to start off, why don't you, from the last lesson, let's see if we can remember a little bit. Why don't you just make a list for me of whatever you want.
Let's do some numbers. Commas.
There you go.
And maybe some strings too. String 9. And then another string, let's say hello. How about that?
Okay, cool. So now, below that, why don't you just, remembering how to iterate through with that for loop, why don't you just print each element in that list with the for loop there?
Okay, so for lm, what's this next syntax here that I need? N?
Yep.
Or ln in list 1, right?
Yep.
Print lm, right?
Yep. The only thing is you got to change the
parentheses and then brackets. Right? Yeah, I don't need. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And then you just forgot the colon on line 2 there at the end of it.
Yep, you're right. Okay.
Yep. Why don't you run this? So you have to probably go up to run to start it off, and then the configuration you have. Yep. There you go.
Cool.
So print will, add a new line at the end of those. So that's great. That's how you loop through. So now, let's say instead of that list there, so you can go ahead and let's define a string. So you can leave the list, that's fine.
Okay.
So let's define a string, call it, whatever you want. Call it something. Chips, all right. And then just a string, let's call it, don't use any brand names, but just say like, equal to whatever you want. You can do hello if you want. Just a string though, not a list this time. So that's a list of a string. So let's just make this a string itself without the brackets. And I'm going to show you. So now, again, the main topic of this is loops and iterating through things. So lists and strings are really similar in the methods they have and how you loop through them. So what do you think will happen if, using line 2 as a reference, why don't you type for lm in chips? And then print lm. And then just for not to clutter up the console there, why don't you delete lines 2 and 3? So what do you think is going to happen here?
I think it'll print hello, the string hello.
All right, why don't you run it? We'll see what happens. So when you iterate through a string, using that syntax you have there for lm will be assigned to the character in each string. And believe it or not, you can index a string to get a character the same way you index a list to get an element list. So want to say you want the E.
Print 1.
In this case, you're going to have to say, so this is in your for loop, right?
Print. And then 1.
Element is actually, why don't we remove the for loop in this case here?
Remove the what? The for loop?
Just remove the loop. Yeah. And then make sure your indentation level matches there. Yep.
Okay, so I'd say print chips 1, I think.
And then just make sure you have square brackets instead of the parentheses there.
In here?
So anytime you're indexing, you're going to have square brackets when you're dealing with lists, strings, things like that. And then these are pretty much just for your function calls and things like that. So why don't you print that there? There you go. All right. Now, it's now I think, we're looping through lists and you use that for something in something else syntax, right? It's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Using list one as an example, what if, actually, you know what we'll do? We're going to learn a new method called range. So if you remember back to C, C++, right, when you used to do that, remember how when you were iterating through, you had this index generally assigned to I, like for I equals 0, I plus plus, or I less than something, I plus plus, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So there's a really, I guess, a way you could do, there's a couple ways to do it, but one way is by using the range function. So range is going to return, so why don't you just print and then do range, the word, and do 6 in there. Range 6, yeah. Leave the print chips 1 there, so we don't clear it. Yeah, run that. Oh, that's gonna print that, right? So instead, actually, let's do 4x in range 6.
What, for loop?
Yeah, 4 range 6. Yeah. My bad. Go ahead and enter there. Yeah, you can delete that, and then print x. So instead of range 6, just print x. See what happens. So range will allow you to loop through some range of numbers. So notice that it starts at 0, right? And it does not include 6, so it's 6 non-inclusive. So there's technically six numbers there because it starts with 0, but in this case, it doesn't actually include 6, right? Very cool. So now with your range 6 there, let's start working with some conditional statements, right? Some if, else if, and else loops.
Okay.
So do you remember how to check? So to start off, actually change range to 10 or 11. And then do you remember how to check if a number is even? Do you remember the fancy operator that you can use?
Is it like
totally fine.
Even or like dot even? I don't know.
Nope. So why don't you just remove that print and then we'll start working with the conditionals we want to add. So to check if a number is even, there's the mod operator. I don't know if you remember that, it's the percent sign. So what you can do is x is going to be a number like we just saw in that print statement. So you can say if x, and then mod is the percent sign, right? So mod, what that returns is it's basically the remainder of division. So if I mod 3 with 2, that will return 1. And if I mod 50 with 2, it's going to return 0. So by modding something with 2, if it returns 0, then you know the number is even. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so why don't you mod x with 2? And then you can say space equals equals for comparison, and then 0. So what we just said in English there, with a colon at the end, what we just said there was if x is even, then you can print the word even. There you go. It's good that you remember to put the quotes. That's usually a common mistake.
Getting there.
So now, let's say we also want to print when it's divisible by 5. How would you do that?
If x percent 5 equals 0.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but now what I'm going to, and then you can do an else there. So else, and then put a colon. And you can just say print anything you want.
Do not divisible by 2.
So now let's say that every iteration of this loop, we only want to print one thing. What you have here, what happens when x equals 10?
Oh, it's going to print both of these.
Right. So do you remember back in the C++ a way to make sure that only one of these conditionals is executed in each iteration here? So there's if statements, there's else statements, and what else?
If else.
If else, right? Or else if, right?
Else if. Okay.
So in Python, the syntax is elif, E-L-I-F there. So you can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So now you're ensuring that only one of these in these three conditionals here is going to be executed. Otherwise, if you had it previously there, what actually happens is that first if has no corresponding else. So it'll drop down to the second one, and then what would actually happen with the first one is even if it's even, it would probably also print not divisible by 2 or 5, except for in the case of when it is divisible by 5, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So why don't you run this and we'll see if we get what we expect.
Okay. Yeah, even, because that takes priority because that's the first if for 10.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the 1, 5, and the rest are even.
Yeah.
Not divisible.
So now change it back to what you had previously. And then let's run that. Okay, you get all this extra stuff there.
Yeah.
So, and what you can actually do is in the print statement there, after the string, so whatever string, so in the first case there on line 8, even, right? You can type even, the quote, and then comma X. And then you can do that for all of them. So then that way we can actually see what X is at each time. Now run it. I'll show you.
Do we want to else if this or keep that?
For now, let's just run it with the incorrect. Yeah.
Okay.
So you see the counter, right? You see how 2 appears twice, and 4 is appearing twice there. So that's because that else is only corresponding to the if above it. But by adding elif, now if you do that, else if is probably more way people actually say it than run that. Now you'll see that we only get one output per number.
Yeah. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
All right, great. So in the next, actually, we'll do one other thing before we have a little bit of time. So why don't we, in this case here, why don't you on line 10 there, instead of printing that, why don't you just say continue, the word continue. So we get rid of the print and we're going to type continue. So do you know what this keyword does?
So I guess that if x equals 5, then we're not going to do anything, and we're just going to go next.
Why don't you run it? We'll see what happens.
Or I might need a colon here. I'm not sure.
Right. So follow the counter and see what happens.
Okay. Right. So it just skipped 5.
Yep. So continue. It's a weird keyword. It's general. I would say a lot of the time it's considered bad practice. Usually you can write code in a way that avoids this. But yeah, basically what it does is, remember, we're looping through the numbers 0 to 10, right?
Yeah.
And if it hit a number divisible by 5, it'll just go to the next iteration of the loop, and it won't touch anything else.
Okay.
So if you had a ton of code below that, it would just go right to the next loop. It doesn't care. As soon as you use that word.
So it would skip whatever is underneath it. Like it would skip this else, or like if it was
if there was more code below that, it would skip it too.
Gotcha.
It's actually corresponding to the for loop rather than the conditional statement. So even if you didn't have all these conditionals and everything, it would just jump to the next iteration of the loop. So now instead of continue, type break. Now what do you think this is going to do?
It's going to somehow break, like stop. Oh, it's going to stop the for loop. That's what it's going to do.
All right, run it. We'll see what happens.
Aha.
There you go. Yep. So it quits right out. So if you get some weird, say you really want to catch something, you want to get out, you can use break. So break and continue, they're good to kind of have in mind. A lot of people forget that continue exists. Like I said, it's kind of a weird keyword. Pretty much avoidable a lot of the times. So, but yeah, overall good job. We'll cut this part here. We'll get started on part 2 where we're gonna go through some nested for loops and some other fancy stuff. So good job.
Cool. Thank you.